Okay, so everybody's got the homework for Thursday, right? We're reading a Frederick Douglass essay. Going to submit at least 3 words to the vocab folder, which you don't have to do for tonight if you've already done for these readings. And you're going to be working on exploratory reflection too, right? So does anybody have any questions about the second exploratory reflection?
It's just like the first one.
You're doing the same thing you did in the first one, but with a different set of texts, yeah. So you have you can choose for this one from the Confucius, the Gandhi, the Bentham, or the Guin. You can use any of those 4. Otherwise, you are doing this. You're doing the same thing. Yeah. Okay. So if nobody has any questions about homework, I want to focus for a second on the quote that I've put up on the projector here. This is from 19th century Russian novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. And it's part of a conversation between 2 brothers. One of the brothers is a novice priest, and the other is a brilliant philosopher who is also an atheist. And this is coming from the brother who is the philosopher. He's asking this question of his brother, the priest, right? So imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me, and tell the truth. So what's the basic question that's being asked here?
Why could you be happy knowing that is at the extent of someone else?
Yeah, even if it's just one other person, right? Or one other creature that is barely even aware of its existence, its surroundings, right? Does the suffering of that one creature justify your is your happiness justified if one tiny creature has to suffer to create it, right? And so Ivan's question here relates to religion specifically, right? Remember that his brother is a priest, and he's talking about sort of, the Christian promise of a good afterlife after a life of suffering in this world, right? But this is actually a question that is relevant both to Bentham's essay and to Ursula Le Guin's response to it. For one thing, this kind of creates this is the imaginative origin of Ursula Le Guin's story. She's trying to create a society in which this question is answered. Whereas Bentham is trying to set up a society that is optimized for human happiness, right? So, let's start with Bentham, who's writing here in 1780. And see what we can pull out of this, right? So what were you guys able to get out of the Bentham essay? What did you grasp from this?
He's not very fond of the wealthy.
Pardon?
He's not very fond of the wealthy or people that are off.
Okay, why would you say that?
Well, the word American economist just occurred a lot in his essay, and it was really what followed it was talking kind of badly
Okay, I think you probably got this mixed up with the Joseph Stiglitz essay, which is what we were going to read for today, but because of stuff that happened last week, right? We're going back to the stuff we were supposed to read for last week.
So what page is that?
The Jeremy Bentham is on 464 to 467. It's called the Principle of Utility. Okay, why would you say disapprove? And again, I think you're mixing the Bentham up with the Ursula Le Guin, right? Le Guin is talking about the community that's built on the suffering of that one child, right? Is that what you're thinking of?
Okay, I think about page 460, no, 497.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, you're talking, yeah, like the 480 to 485 is a Le Guin essay. And that's where she has the story about the city where everybody's happy.
Yes.
But okay, so Le Guin is responding to Jeremy Bentham, right? But yeah, we're focusing right now on the Jeremy Bentham piece. So let's set up a little bit of context, and then we'll kind of dig into this a little bit, and we'll compare it to what Le Guin was writing in the early 1970s, right? So Jeremy Bentham is the father of a school of philosophy called utilitarianism. And of course, all of these markers are crap, probably because I pressed too hard on my arrow board. Oh, hey, here we go. And utilitarianism is born out of Bentham's key insight, right? That human beings are motivated by two things. The first is desire for reward. And the second is fear of punishment. And so he gets to thinking about this in terms of human systems and institutions, right? It's like, why do people, for example, obey the dictates of a particular religion? Is it because the rules set forth in that religion are themselves intrinsically good? Or is it because they hope to get something out of following those rules? The same goes with following the law, right? You know, now, following the law in whatever country you live in may not get you rewards, but it does help you to avoid punishment, right? So Bentham argues that this is all, that this is the root of all human behavior. That all we really want is to be rewarded for doing something good and not to be punished. So, to test out some of these theories, he actually designed a model prison. It's called the Panopticon. And it looks something like this. You've got a central tower from which a guard can see into all of the prisoners' cells. So I'll just put little guys in each of these. Now, why do you think I've made these arrows one way? What does that suggest about the Panopticon design?
That they can't see him.
Exactly. It's one way. So the prisoners never know whether they're being watched at any given time. They just know that their behavior might always be watched. Bentham's theory was that knowing that there might be somebody watching you all the time would induce you to change your behavior, right? In order to avoid being punished by the guard for infractions of the rules. And that this was then a way to reform human behavior, right? If you put criminals in a prison like this and they feel like they're constantly being watched, it will get them to follow the rules in order to avoid being punished, right? Now this was actually, believe it or not, an improvement on the previous model of British prisons, which had been suggested by certain religious formers. What they used to do was lock people in dark rooms with a candle and a Bible, arguing that if they had nothing to do but read the Bible, then this would induce a change in their behavior, right? That this would induce them to change their path in life, right? Now, what do we know about what really happens to people when you lock them alone in dark rooms? Yeah. So this is what tended to happen, right? Extended solitary confinement, particularly in a dark room, tends to make people go insane. Only one of these prisons on Bentham's model was ever actually built. It still exists, but it's no longer in use. It's in Dublin, Ireland. It's the newer wing of the city's old jail, which is called Kilmainham. So you can actually go and see it, right? I've been to one of the. I've been to this. I've seen, what it looks like, how it works. But Bentham is writing in a context, or in the context of a revolution in European thought called the Enlightenment. Now, have you guys heard the term Enlightenment before, like in particularly in reference like the late 18th, early 19th century? You're nodding a lot here, Gia. So what is the Enlightenment? What do you know about it?
Where people become enlightened, or they realize that, what's going on isn't right, so they begin to look and roll. Right? Yeah.
Sort of, yeah. And in a general sense, that's kind of what enlightenment means, right? But if we're looking at a kind of an 18th century intellectual movement, really, right? So, the Enlightenment is inspired by the rise of modern scientific reasoning in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? So how do we do science today? How does science typically work?
You got a person with microscopes and all that good stuff.
Okay.
Studying other things with their application.
Okay. Are you familiar with the idea of the scientific method?
Sadly.
What's that?
I said sadly.
Okay. Sadly, all right. Well, maybe you'll prefer the past method that I'm going to tell you about in a moment, right? But how's the scientific method work? What is the scientific method?
Like you have to come up with like a thesis, and then you have to test your thesis.
Yeah.
And you have to come up with another one in the end to see if yours is right. I hated it.
Yeah, it's basically a process of observation and testing, right? You make an observation of some natural phenomenon. You develop a theory or a hypothesis rather, as to why this happens, right? And then you test it over and over again to see if you get the same results. And if we keep getting the same results over and over and over again, after dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of tests, then that hypothesis becomes a theory, right? So this is one thing to know, right? When we talk about theory in common everyday language, right, we're usually talking about something that's unproven, right? When we talk about theory in science, we're talking about something that pretty sure that's how it works, or it's pretty well tested. But when Bentham was writing in 1780, the scientific method was still relatively new, right? This is a product of the late 17th century. Before, the way people did science was based on, it was still based on observation, right? You observed something in nature, but what you were looking for were what were called correspondences. For example, if someone was sick with a blood disease, what a doctor might do is say, mix some powdered ruby into a glass of red wine and have the person drink it. What's the logic there that operates there? Why would you apply powdered ruby and red wine to cure a blood disease? Because they're all red, right? Yeah. And, if you did so when the sun was in the sign Aries, which was related to the color red, then that was supposed to strengthen the effect, right? The idea here being that like cures like, and unlike repels unlike. So to us, this sounds a little bit closer to magic, right? But prior to the Enlightenment, this was how people did science, right? And it seems strange to us, right? But to people who were operating under this system, it seemed perfectly logical. Right? Well, of course, red things are useful for curing blood diseases. Blood is red, right? So Bentham is writing at a time when the replacement of this old system of correspondences is still ongoing and underway, right? Intellectual elites have bought into this whole scientific method thing, but ordinary people, by and large, haven't. Now, one thing that comes along with the introduction of the scientific method is this notion that it's not just natural phenomena that might be more orderly, right? Societies can also be made to be more orderly by banishing superstition. Right? No more ghosts, ghouls, and angels. No more little demons on your shoulder telling you to do bad things. Let's actually try to get at the roots of the motivations of human behavior and see what we can do to set up a society that then works for more people. So, what Bentham then comes up with is this principle of what he calls utility. Can I get somebody to read the first paragraph on page 464 of Bentham's essay here? Thank you, Gia.
Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice
Caprice.
instead of reason, and darkness instead of light.
Okay, thank you. So, if we boil all of this verbiage down, right, what is Bentham suggesting all human behavior comes down to?
Pain and pleasure.
Yeah. Everything is motivated by these two impulses, right? The one which we want to achieve and the other which we want to avoid, right? If we look at the way he phrases this here, right? Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, right? What's a sovereign?
I've heard of it.
Okay, you've heard the word. Maybe if we break the word down, right? So if we just look at this second half of the word, R-E-I-G-N, do we recognize that?
Brain,
Reign.
like you have power over people.
Yeah. Yeah, a sovereign is a ruler, right? So sometimes all it takes to figure out an unfamiliar word and what it means is just to kind of break down its parts, right? It's like, okay, well, I know what this means, right? So then, given the context, this must mean someone who rules, right? And a sovereign is usually not like, a sovereign is not like an elected leader, right? You know, a sovereign is not like a president or a congressman or, you know, a prime minister even, what have you, right? A sovereign is typically an absolute hereditary ruler. Like a king or a queen, exactly. So the fact that nature has placed us under these sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, what is he suggesting about the power that pleasure and pain have over us?
They're absolute.
Yeah, that their power is absolute and is inherited throughout time, right? That in each successive generation it's the same. All human beings are motivated by these two things, right? All human systems, right? The standard of right and wrong, the chain of causes and effects, right? So ethics and science are both ruled by pleasure and pain. Now, I think it's interesting. There's one sentence here at the end of the paragraph that I want to point to as well here. So the principle of utility recognizes this subjection, right? So the principle he wants to come up with recognizes, first and foremost, that this is the unavoidable fact of human life, right? And assumes that for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. So we don't necessarily need to know yet what all the terms in that sentence mean in order to figure out what the metaphor is, right? So he talks about rearing the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. How do you make a fabric with your hands? What is that process called? Sewing, you actually already have the fabric and you're just stitching pieces together, right? But you're thinking along the right lines. Let's say what you're trying to make is a fabric itself, right? You're trying to make cotton, say.
I was about to say, like the whole process of cotton.
Pardon?
I was going to say that with like the cotton.
Yeah. So yeah, it's essentially what he's referring to is the process of weaving, right? Right, you use your hands to take all these different strings, right? You string them across a loom, and you weave them together into a single fabric, right? So you're taking many disparate things, many separate things, and forming them into one. So this is a metaphor that's about unity. It's about bringing things together. You rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Do either of you know what felicity is, what felicity means? Okay, so felicity means happiness and kind of general well-being. So he's talking about making laws that promote well-being for everybody, right? And the basic way that you do that is by making laws that increase pleasure for the largest possible number of people, and that decrease pain for the largest possible number of people, right? Sound good so far? Okay. So, as we continue on down here, right? He says at the bottom of page 464, actually, can I get somebody to read the paragraph number 4 here? It says the interest of community is one of the most general expressions. Go ahead, Ron.
The interest of the community is one of the most general expressions that can occur in the phraseology of the world. No wonder that the meaning of it is often lost. When it has a meaning, it is this: the community is a fixed body composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting as it were its members. The interest of the community then is what? The sum of the interest of the several members.
Okay, so this is actually related to this weaving metaphor, right? But what's the thing he's comparing the community to now? So if you compared felicity, like if you compared well-being to a fabric that's woven by reason and law, what is he comparing the community to here?
A body?
A body, yes. The community is a body. And the individual persons who are considered as constituting it were its members, right? Now here he's not talking about members as in like members of a club or an organization, right? What's the other meaning of members? Do you know what it means to dismember someone or something?
Take apart?
Yeah. Essentially, when you're dismembering, like it's something that's usually, used in terms of human or animal bodies, right? You are essentially separating all of the pieces, right? So what members are parts of a complex system. Right. Parts of a body, individuals within a society or within a group. These are the sorts of things that we refer to as members, right? So, what do we know about a body in which, say, one of the members is missing or is out of control in some way?
The body would not, the whole body would not function.
Yeah. a body that is not whole, at least theoretically, does not function properly, right? We can probably compare this to Audre Lorde's language about cancer, right? When she's thinking about, community in terms of a body as well. But I think Bentham is moving in a slightly different direction here, right? Bentham is actually talking about the subjection of all individuals within a body, right? That what we need to do is figure out how to give the most possible pleasure to the most people and reduce the most possible pain for the most people. Which at various points here he says, he keeps repeating the phrase, what comes to the same thing, right? So for him, increasing pleasure and decreasing pain basically mean the same thing, right? Pleasure is the absence of pain. Pain is the absence of pleasure. So how well does that work as a definition, do you think?
It would be confusing.
Okay. What's confusing about it?
Because, they're opposites, but you can't have, they go hand in hand.
Right, you're defining them both in terms of the other, right? Is there a kind of subjective element to this as well? Is pleasure for me necessarily the same as pleasure for you?
No.
And our definitions of pain might be different as well, right? So Bentham is talking as though these are simple concepts, right? That have basic shared meaning, basic shared definitions that cross cultural, regional, national boundaries, right? That all human beings are motivated by the same things. And I guess, to an extent, yeah, that's true, right? But not all human beings would define these two things the same way, right? So, this is one of the points that Ursula Le Guin hits on in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? That pleasure and pain aren't the same for all people. That not everybody's picture of the perfect society is going to match up. And that a society can't be said to be perfect, right? If it's built on its very foundations from an injustice. So let's turn now to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So this is written almost 200 years after Bentham's essay. But Bentham's thinking, the reason we still refer back to Bentham is because his thinking is actually hugely influential. Even in the way, in terms of even contemporary policy making, right? Contemporary economists still lean on several of his principles. Even just, the very idea, like in thinking about passing a law, right? Okay, how many people is this going to help versus how many people is this going to hurt, right? So one of the big debates, for example, right now, I guess, are you guys familiar with the concept of the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal, I don't know how much news you guys are watching and seeing. Okay, so basically, there's coming out of the left wing of the Democratic Party, there's an argument that investing in green energy technologies, wind power, solar power, hydroelectric power, geothermal power, things like that, right, can not only be better for the environment, but can also be a powerful engine of job creation. However, there is a counter-argument that comes from another common Democratic Party constituency, labor unions, that most of the jobs in those fields are non-union, so they don't pay as much and they don't offer protections of the same kind. And that there also aren't as many workers required to institute a lot of these technologies. So, for example, solar energy, right? You need a lot of people to mine for coal or drill for oil. Once you've got the solar panels manufactured and set up, you don't really need a lot of people to run that solar farm, right? You basically just need a couple of supervisory staff to manage it, and you're good. So, a law that is, perhaps a net good for a large number of people might still end up hurting a smaller subset of people, right? Because it hasn't accounted for their particular needs. And I think Guin is trying to deal with these kinds of balances, right? So let's turn now to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, page 480. And let's look just first at the way she sets this city up for us, right? I'm gonna read the first paragraph, just follow along with me, and take note of what stands out to you here and why. With a clamor of bells that set the swallows soaring, the festival of summer came to the city Omelas, bright towered by the sea. The rigging of the boats in harbor sparkled with flags. In the streets, between houses with red roofs and painted walls, between old moss-grown gardens and under avenues of trees, past great parks and public buildings, processions moved. Some were decorous. Old people in long, stiff robes of mauve and gray, grave master workmen, quiet, merry women carrying their babies and chatting as they walked. In other streets, the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. Children dodged in and out, their high calls rising like the swallows crossing flights over the music and the singing. All the processions wound towards the north side of the city, where on the great water meadow called the Green Fields, boys and girls, naked in the bright air, with mud-stained feet and ankles, and long, lithe arms, exercised their restive horses before the race. The horses wore no gear at all but a halter without bit. Their manes were braided with streams of silver, gold, and green. They flared their nostrils and pranced and boasted to one another. They were vastly excited, the horse being the only animal who has adopted our ceremonies as his own. Far off to the north and west, the mountains stood up half encircling Omelas on her day. The air of morning was so clear that the snow still crowning the 18 peaks burned with white gold fire across the miles of sunlit air under the dark blue of the sky. There was just enough wind to make the banners that marked the racecourse snap and flutter now and then. In the silence of the broad green meadows, one could hear the music winding through the city streets, farther and nearer and ever approaching, a cheerful, faint sweetness of the air that from time to time trembled and gathered together and broke out into the great joyous clanging of the bells. So what stands out to you here in this description of the city of Omelas?
Just all happy get married. Nothing's wrong.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is a scene of human happiness, right?
It's like the ideal city.
And let's try to delve into the details here of like what makes this place seem happy or ideal or harmonious. What's it got going? What does Omelas have going for it?
The people went dancing, the procession went dance.
Uh-huh.
Children dodging in and out, crossing flights over the music and the singing. All the horses are just so excited.
Uh-huh.
They don't have They don't need any gear or anything on because they're not a threat.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, they don't have to be controlled, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the reason you put a halter or a bit on a horse, is to control them.
The morning was so clear that the snow still coming burned with like old fire.
Yeah, this is like the natural beauty of the place is emphasized here too, right? And I think there's something else going on here with the nature description, right? Far off to the north and west, the mountains stood up half encircling Omelas on her bay, right? So on the one side of the city, there's a bay. On the other half, it's encircled by mountains.
So it's like a beach and mountains in the...
Yeah, so you've got two beautiful scenic vistas, right? But if it's got water on one side and mountains on the other, what else does this tell us about it?
It's like a valley, I guess.
Yeah, it's like enclosed, right? It's in its own special little space, right? Now I want to go back to the thing about the procession here too, right? We're given two descriptions of the procession, right? So there is the one where there's all the music and the dancing, right?
And then on the other street is like quiet.
Yeah, and then there's the more kind of quiet, ritualistic, dignified procession, right? Now, in terms of what we were just talking about in Jeremy Bentham's essay, why does it matter that the procession here takes two different forms? Both of which are clearly intended to give us a sense that the participants enjoy them, right? The participants find this pleasurable.
Because one person's happiness isn't the other person's happiness.
Yeah, that fungible definition of pleasure, right? And what does the paragraph both open and close with?
Bells.
Yeah.
Playing with bells.
It opens and closes with bells. So, what can the clanging of bells signify?
Like something just happened, like an event or
Uh-huh.
a victory or like
Yeah. So the context here seems to be celebration, right? But if you've got a clanging of bells, what else can that mean? What other kind of event can this be?
it could be like a warning.
Yeah. The other context in which we tend to hear the clanging of bells, like if we heard a clanging of bells in this building right now, right?
It would be almost suspicious.
Yeah, it'd be an alarm, right? And I think that we have to take both of these meanings into account here, right? That the bells, because they bookend the paragraph, are clearly important, right? And yeah, they could be just marking the celebration, right? This is the festival of summer. So summer itself is a season we associate with what?
Happiness.
Yeah, happiness and warmth and life and relaxation, right? I mean, even in terms of like the agricultural cycle, what happens during the summer?
Things grow.
Pardon? Things,
Things
yeah.
grow.
Yeah, this is the period of ripening, right? You plant in the spring, and then over the course of the summer, the plants grow, they mature, so you can harvest them in the autumn, right? So yeah, so this is the season that we most associate with life and growth. And everything here seems to be kind of just enough, right? There's just enough wind for an aesthetic effect, but not enough for it to be uncomfortable and unpleasant. There's just enough glow on the mountains and on the water, right? Not enough to be glaring. And everything here looks great, and everyone looks happy. One more thing I want to note before we move on here, too. Do we notice any particular strand in the sentence about the dancing procession here, right? In the other streets, the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. Think about the two instruments that are described here and what they have in common with each other.
I'm not 100% sure what a gong is.
Okay. A gong is, it's like a big brass disc that you hang,
Okay, yeah.
and you hit it with a mallet,
Yeah.
and it makes that kind of shimmering sound.
Mhm.
So what do a gong and a tambourine have in common with each other?
They both require a disc.
Okay, yeah, they're the same shape. They're both disc-shaped, yeah.
But I feel like a gong makes a louder, more dignifying noise.
Yeah. But how do you play both of them?
You hit it.
Yeah, exactly. You make sound out of it by hitting it. When they talk about the music beat louder, right? Yeah, there is a strand here of making pleasurable noise out of hitting things. Now, how might this relate to what we now know from having read the whole thing is the foundation of the good life in Omelas? How do they get, what's the bargain, or what's the price that they have to pay to get all of these good things?
One person will suffer.
Yeah, the torture and suffering of this one child, right? And I think, yeah, the fact that they use the word beat specifically here, right, is suggestive of something nasty underlying all of this, right? Because, yeah, beat refers to rhythm, but it also refers to violently striking someone repeatedly. So we can already see layers of complication in all of this, right? The fact that this is an enclosed space, that the bells might be, are just as likely an alarm as a celebration, and that the procession has all of these words, all of this language is associated with hitting, right? Joyous. How is one to tell about joy? How to describe the citizens of Omelas? They were not simple folk, you see, though they were happy. But we do not say the words of cheer much anymore. All smiles have become archaic. Given a description such as this, one tends to make certain assumptions. Given a description such as this, one tends to look next for the king, mounted on a splendid stallion and surrounded by his noble knights, or perhaps in a golden litter borne by great muscled slaves, but there was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. So what is she saying here we tend to expect? Like, what kind of story do we usually think we're being told if we're told that the people of this place were happy?
That something's going to happen to make them not happy.
Okay.
And
That's
then the hero's going to come in and
Uh-huh.
save them, and then they'll be happy.
okay, and I think let's think more along the lines of like what kind of story features kings and barbarians and heroes.
So like medieval.
Yeah. That we think of an older, archaic society when we think of these kinds of things, right? We think almost like a world of you didn't use the term, but what you're describing is basically the plot of a fairy tale, right? And with what stage of life do we tend to associate fairy tales?
A child.
Yeah. So the suggestion here is that we tend to regard happiness as something naive and childish, right? Children are happy because they don't know how to be otherwise. Although I will say that some of the most annoying adults I know are people who seem to be happy and cheerful all the time because they don't seem to know how to be otherwise. I do not know the rules and laws of their society, but I suspect that they were singularly few. As they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. So she's told us specifically that this is not a fairy tale society. What else is it not? If they get on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb.
Like the utopia.
Well, why would these things in particular disturb our idea of utopia? What do they have in common with each other?
They cause stress.
Okay. Yeah, these are sources of stress, right? Though not all for entirely the same reason. Although, well, maybe they are, actually. How do the stock exchange and the advertisement cause stress?
Because you're constantly watching it.
Uh-huh. Because you want to make more money and have more stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The stock exchange lets you know where your investments rank relative to other people's, right? And the advertisement tells you what sorts of things you're supposed to want. So both of these are involved in kind of like both economic and status stress, right?
They often cause pleasure or pain.
Yeah, if your stock is riding high, then that causes pleasure, right? If your stock takes a dip, not so much. Yeah, these are also sources of pleasure and pain. Good. Now, what about the secret police and the bomb?
I mean, depending on where the bomb is.
But and I think we have to remember when this is written too, right? In 1973, it's the height of the Cold War, right? The United States and the Soviet Union as the world's two superpowers, both nuclear armed, both their arsenals aimed at each other. The Vietnam War is still in full swing, right? And there's still, within relatively recent memory, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So people have actually seen nuclear weapons used and what that can do, right? So the bomb really is a kind of like especially in 1973, it's a real present existential threat, right? And the secret police are a similar, kind of, they'll, take you, I think she's thinking in particular of the kinds of secret police that you had in the Soviet Union under the KGB and in Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany with the Stasi, right, where anybody who was guilty of thought crime, kind of thinking against the regime was likely to end up dead or disappeared. Although this also happened in countries with far right-wing governments. In Chile, for example, under the government of General Pinochet in the 70s, a whole lot of people who were known to be associated with the Communist Party of Chile just disappeared. And then in the late 80s, people found out where they'd gone as their bodies started washing up on the shore. So, the way a lot of these mid-20th century regimes had a way of making whoever their enemies were vanish, right? So yeah, the secret police are actually, I think the secret police also, this idea is a nod to Bentham's idea of the panopticon. Can you ever really be happy in a society where you feel like you're being watched all the time? I mean that as a serious question. Does the prospect of being watched all the time, like being observed and tracked, does that actually improve your quality of life or improve your happiness? This is one of the debates we're having about the internet now, right? Is the extent to which companies should be allowed to observe and track us. When we use social media, or when we go from site to site and there are tracking cookies that follow us, right? Should advertisers be allowed to take our information and sell it, right?
To the point where they read my mind. So.
Yeah, we've noticed even I don't use social media anymore because I got tired of having arguments before the election with people I hadn't spoken to in 25 years. That was just causing me too much stress. And I don't use my phone very much, and I have all the tracking kind of turned off on it, which actually makes having the phone inconvenient because nothing works properly if you turn off all the tracking stuff. My wife's stuff is all still active though. We've even noticed when we're watching something on if we're watching a show on Hulu and it's one of those where you can't turn the ads off. The ads often correspond to things that she recently ordered or to conversations we've had in a disturbing kind of way. So I don't think that these two things were quite so interrelated in 1973, but they're definitely part of a related complex now. And one thing that I think this shows is that I think we're a little bit less frightened of nuclear annihilation in the immediate future than people were in 1973. But otherwise, our worries are not much different, right? They were afraid of a lot of the same things. But in Omelas, one of the things that makes this a beautiful, perfect society is that people can do without these, right? These things are not necessary in Omelas. Now, to move a little further down, other things that they have and don't have about in Omelas, right? Further down towards page 41, right? Perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bids, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. For instance, how about technology? I think that there would be no cars or helicopters in and above the streets. This follows from the fact that the people of Omelas are happy people. Happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. In the middle category, however, that of the unnecessary but undestructive, that of comfort, luxury, exuberance, etc., they could perfectly well have central heating, subway trains, washing machines, and all kinds of marvelous devices not yet invented here, floating light sources, fuelless power, a cure for the common cold. Or they could have none of that. It doesn't matter. So why do you think she's so fuzzy about what Omelas does or doesn't? Not so much about what it doesn't have, right? She's pretty clear on what they don't have. Why is she so fuzzy on what they do have?
They don't have much. If they don't have like none of this,
Mhm.
then they really don't have a lot.
Well, is she saying that they don't have these things, and it doesn't matter whether they have these things?
That doesn't matter.
Yeah. So who's she leaving it up to decide?
Yeah. Us?
Yeah. She's leaving it up to the reader, right, to decide how you want to picture this society, right? She's saying what they don't have, but it's like, but if you want them to have these other things, great. And how is this also kind of harkening back to Bentham's ideas? How is this also harkening back to Bentham's ideas of pleasure and pain?
There's not really that idea of it in
Yeah. He doesn't clearly define it, right? So, please yourself, right? If the people in Omelas are perfectly happy, then picture what it would take for you to be perfectly happy, right? And this is when she moves later in the paragraph into descriptions like, okay, if you think that there should be orgies, let there be orgies, right?
that was like,
Yeah.
what?
Well, I think what happens when she talks about the orgies and the drugs, right? There are two things about this that are important, right? One is that both are consequence-free, right? Any children born out of these, mass sexual congresses, right, are to be, loved and respected by the community, right? Raised together by the community as kind of special children. And the drugs have no addictive or other unpleasant properties, right? So one of the things that is important in Omelas is a lack of guilt. Right? There's no shame and there's no guilt. Now, I think this is in part to help prepare us for what's to come, right? To remind us this is a society in which shame and guilt do not exist.
Then where is it?
What's that?
I said, then where is it?
Yeah, it's hidden in that little room, right? And also to show how without a clear definition of what pleasure means, you can kind of take that to any direction. She's taking it to its logical extreme, right? Well, okay, what if you just give yourself up to unrestrained pleasure, right? And the price of all this is the torture of that single child, right? Page 483. In a basement under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, again, it doesn't matter where, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. A little light seeps in dustily between the cracks in the boards, secondhand from a cobwebbed window somewhere across the cellar. In one corner of the little room, and a couple of mops with stiff, dotted, foul-smelling heads stand near a rusty bucket. The floor is dirt, a little damp to the touch, as cellar dirt usually is. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide, a mere broom closet or disused tool room. In the room, a child is sitting. It could be a boy or girl. I think one thing to note here, note how Omelas was enclosed, right, between the mountains and the bay, right? This room where Omelas keeps its dark, dirty little secret is also enclosed, right? It looks about 6, but is nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. It picks its nose and occasionally fumbles vaguely with its toes or genitals as it sits hunched in the corner farthest from the bucket and the 2 mops. It is afraid of the mops. It finds them horrible. It shuts its eyes, but it knows the mops are still standing there, and the door is locked, and nobody will come. The door is always locked, and nobody ever comes, except that sometimes the child has no understanding of time or interval. Sometimes the door rattles terribly and opens, and a person, or several people, are there. One of them may come in and kick the child to make it stand up. The others never come close. Peer in at it with frightened, disgusted eyes. The food bowl and the water jug are hastily filled. The door is locked. The eyes disappear. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room and can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. I will be good, it says. Please let me out. I will be good. Why does it matter, by the way, that the child has not lived its entire life in this room? That it remembers sunlight and its mother's voice? Yeah, why is that important?
Because he has, or she has, like, some recollection of what life was, or what life is.
You have to know what's good in order to know what's bad, right? And if you have no recollection of things ever having been pleasant, you don't really suffer, right? Mm-hmm. Suffering is dependent on the knowledge that things could be better. And the whole idea here is that they have to make the child suffer in order for Omelas to function as it does. They all know it is there, the people of Omelas, right? So this isn't a secret. Everybody in the city is aware of this, right? Some of them have come to see it. Others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not. But they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest, and the kindly breathers of their skies, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. This is usually explained to children when they're between 8 and 12, whenever they are capable of understanding. And most of those who come to see the child are young people, though often enough an adult comes or comes back to see the child. No matter how well the matter has been explained to them, these young spectators are always shocked and sickened at the sight. They feel disgust, which they had thought themselves superior to. They feel anger, outrage, impotence, despite all the explanations. They would like to do something for the child, but there is nothing they can do. If the child were brought up into the sunlight out of that vile place, if it were cleaned and fed and comforted, that would be a good thing, indeed. But if it were done, in that day and hour, all the prosperity and beauty and delight of Omelas would wither and be destroyed. Those are the terms. To exchange all the goodness and grace of every life in Omelas for that single small improvement, to throw away the happiness of thousands for the chance of the happiness of one. That will be to let guilt within the walls indeed. And guilt is the destroyer of pleasure, right? Guilt would ruin everybody's happiness. That's why the child can never be let free. The terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be a kind word spoken to the child. Often the young people go home in tears, or in a tearless rage, when they have seen the child and faced this terrible paradox. They may brood over it for weeks or years, but as time goes on, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. It is too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It has been afraid too long to ever be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality and to accept it. So what's the process that's being described here? What happens to these children who were let in on the secret of Omelas, who had it explained to them as they grow older?
They feel bad about it, but then they realize if they do something about it, it won't benefit him or her.
Yeah.
Because it's been so long they've become used to what they're in.
Mm-hmm.
They'll just, hurt them more
Yeah.
if they get bored out of it.
But is the child in the room the only one who has just become too used to things as they are? This is the same thing that's going on with the citizens of Omelas, right? It's unimaginable to them that life might be any different. And so they tell themselves these kind of convincing, kind of they engage in all this motivated reasoning, right, to explain why they shouldn't let the child up, right? That youthful idealism gives way to adult complacency. And then, we're running out of time here, but notice that those who reject this calculus, right, do they try to set the child free?
No, they just leave.
They just leave, yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they just leave instead of setting the child free?
Because they don't want to disturb anybody else's happiness or pleasures.
Yeah. They can't live with it anymore, right? But they also agree that they don't have the right to make that decision for anyone else, right? That if the rest of Omelas wants to have this kind of society, right, I can reject that society, but I can't tell them how they should order it, right? So, this is in all a pretty complicated response to the note, Bentham presents utilitarianism as a simple system, right? And what Guin is showing here is that it's actually built on a very complicated series of trade-offs. And very complicated notions of what's good and right and just and what is not. So, we're going to be moving on next time. We're going to stop talking about issues of justice. Actually, we are still going to be talking about issues of justice when we talk about Frederick Douglass. We'll be moving on to a slightly different unit in our readings. I know I always find this particular story a little disturbing when I read it, and I hope that it shook you up a little bit too.
Yeah, I did.
Well, good.